All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Doing okay? Yeah? A little sleepy? Got your email. All right, a couple things to go over with you here. One thing which somebody reminded me of yesterday, I had my dates wrong, and on the online it says the next exam is on Wednesday. Okay? You guys want to take an exam on Wednesday? You sure? Because I can do it. Because I can be what's the word I'm looking for? I can honor what is posted online if you want me to. Yeah. So that's what I was thinking. Okay, I posted obviously the wrong date, and that's my mistake. Okay, but the exam is not on Wednesday. Okay. My plan is for the exam to be next Monday, a week from today. And I will be posting an exam review online, okay? Basically, I'm going to go decide what's going to be on the exam after we get through class today, okay? And then I'll post it online, and you'll have it, and the exam will be next Monday, okay? The exam will be similar to the last exam, but obviously there won't be any math on this one, at least not that I can think of, right? We haven't covered anything math-wise since... Unless I give you like an anchor and adjust example or something like that, but then that'd be really simplistic. It wouldn't be like decision trees or anything along those lines, okay? But the exam will be next Monday, and I will post an exam review later today for you so you can start looking over that, okay? Any questions about that? No? Okay. Other thing, you all should have received feedback on your second group assignment at this point, okay? You all did pretty well on that. There was nothing that I saw that was poor on it at all, okay? Some groups, though, I've mentioned in comments, like we need to get together and talk because I think at this stage, which is not uncommon, that you're a little bit broad in your interest. And what do we say? Do you have 15 or 20 minutes? You have 20 minutes to give your presentation, right? Yeah, I think it's 20 minutes to give your presentation. It has to be at least 15 minutes long, but you have 20 minutes max, okay? That time will go by like that. That's not a long time to give a talk. It may seem like, holy shit, we got to give a 20-minute talk, but it's going to go by really, really quickly, okay? That being said, if you bite off a really broad area, you're not going to have enough time to do an adequate coverage of this, right? We don't just want, a really, really cursory overview of decision-making and anxiety. That's one of the groups there, okay? Because there's so much there that can influence that. Stress and anxiety can affect different types of decisions in different ways, right? And so we got to narrow down that focus a bit more to, okay, what specifically do we want to focus on here? Right? Do we want to look at anxiety or stress in high-stakes situations? Okay, then there's something that you can look at there. Do you want to look at state anxiety versus trait anxiety? Does that make sense, right? Are we looking at just anxiety at a moment and how that influences decision, or we want to look at chronic anxiety, people that are highly anxious individuals, and how do they make decisions differently than individuals who are not highly anxious? Does that make sense? Those are things that we're going to want to clarify. Other groups have similar things that you're going to want to clarify there. Okay? So that's going to be the key thing is just let's focus, let's narrow down, let's identify what are going to be the specific topics and areas of interest. There's a mouse in the room, apparently. Okay. The other thing that I want to do in regards to that, because we have, 2 weeks from today? What's today's date? The 5th. Oh, yeah. The American-Mexican holiday. Right? You know they don't celebrate Cinco de Mayo in Mexico? They don't celebrate Cinco. You know why? Yes, well, Cinco de Mayo is like us celebrating the Battle of Bunker Hill. Okay? Cinco de Mayo was just a day of a battle in the Mexican Revolution. It wasn't the day that they became independent. Does that make sense, right? It'd be like us, rather than celebrating July 4th, We'd celebrate the day, whatever day it was, April something, right, in which the Battle of Bunker Hill took place. Okay? That's why they don't celebrate it. Anybody know what Mexican Independence Day is? See? You don't know this. This is what they celebrate in Mexico. 16th of September. Right? That's the day they celebrate. So this is an American holiday. But anyway, yeah, so happy Cinco de Mayo. Right? Well, yeah, it's like people like to drink Mexican beer and tequila, right? But yeah, so 2 weeks from today is the third part of your group project that is due. And basically that is now, you've already written one summary, which hopefully you'll take some of the feedback that I've given you on writing that summary, okay? And now you're going to be doing annotated bibliographies for the remainder of your articles, okay? So that's something that we want to do, but we also want to make sure that you have identified appropriate articles here, right? And you've narrowed down your scope. So I'd like to meet with the groups, even if it's for 15 minutes, right? Just to sit down and meet, talk about what your interests are, and try to give a little bit more clarification to where you are and what you're going to be presenting on, okay? So I'm going to send out an email to everybody to basically give you appointment times of when I'm going to be available this week. And I want you as a group to sit there and identify, okay, what time can you come in and meet with me? All right? And we have to do it this week. All right? Because there's no point in putting it, the longer we put it off, the less time you have to fulfill this, okay, to complete the requirements. So I will be sending out an email later today with what my available times are. And you're going to have to work to make it into your schedule to meet with me for 15 minutes, okay? Or so to talk about these things. And it'll have to obviously be first come, first serve. Right? I have a feeling that many people sit there and say, ooh, lunch hour on Wednesday, I'm free. Right? Well, everybody probably is going to be free lunch hour on Wednesday since you guys are here Monday, Wednesday. So we'll have to, there may be other times that you might have to come in outside of what is optimal, but it'll be first come, first serve. Okay? Any questions on generically the feedback that I gave on that? Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, because for ours, one of the articles that we have does not have a DOI, and you said that you wanted a DOI, so I don't know.
Sometimes they won't, sometimes they will. Okay. If I said generally look for the DOI, that's one thing. If I said this article has a DOI, that means that I went and looked up the article and I found the DOI for it. Okay, so that's probably, if it's that one, I probably found the DOI for it. Okay? For many of you, though, you need to one of the things that we'll talk about there is some of you had formatting issues if you didn't include DOIs at all. Okay? Now, with everything being available online, we need to have the DOIs there. So that article, if I wrote specifically you need it for this one, I went and I found the DOI for that article. Okay? So we'll have to talk about that. Okay? But in general, the articles that typically don't have DOIs are old articles. Anything after 2000 will have a DOI. Okay? Or will, I guess I shouldn't be that absolute with it. Anything after 2000 should definitely have a DOI. Anything beforehand, especially much older, like 60s, 70s, 80s, they're less likely to have a DOI on them. Okay? Any other general questions? No? Doing okay? No? Right there, there's one no. Stressing out a little bit? Yeah. I know the feeling. I'm ready to lose my mind. Trying to decide which is the less addictive of the stimulants. Because coffee isn't working anymore, so I just got to stay awake. So if anybody has any idea of, meth or coke, somebody give me some ideas here, okay? There you go. Find out what's the less addictive of the stimulants. I just got to get that little push past right now, right? Talking like an addict, okay? All right, so let's move on here. I want to spend time today talking about a couple things. I want to finish up our discussion last class of representativeness, just to make sure that we kind of put a pin in that and we're good with that. And then we want to talk about the explanation-based approach to understanding decision making. Okay? So last class, we finished up talking about availability. What is availability? I don't want you to read the definition. I want you to produce it out of your own head, right? In your own words. What's the availability heuristic?
How easily we can remember it. How easily it comes back by relating units that we already have in our knowledge base.
Kind of. What's the availability heuristic? You're on the right path, but what is the availability heuristic? Okay, so we make a judgment based upon what? How easy it is. So the availability heuristic isn't just how easy it is. The availability heuristic is that we use that ease of retrieval as a proxy for making a decision. Okay, does that make sense? So I said the heuristic is not just how easy it comes to mind. The heuristic is that we use that ease of retrieval as the determinant for making the judgment. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say. What is the availability heuristic? It's not just describing what it means that something is available. It means describing how we use that information to influence the decision. Okay, so availability is judging how easily something comes to mind, and we use that. What do we call that? How easily something comes to mind? Fluency, right? The fluency of retrieving a piece of information will influence our assessment of how likely or probable that event is. Right? That's availability. What is representativeness? Does representativeness say that we judge the likelihood of something based upon how easily we can think of an example of it? Okay, so it's whether it belongs to a category. So what is the representativeness heuristic then? How do we use that information? Right, you're describing what representativeness is, right? Just like Luann described what availability was. But now the question is, what's the heuristic in which we use representativeness? What does that say? But we got to be more specific than that. You're on the right path, right? If availability is that we judge the likelihood of something by how easily we can bring an example to mind, that's the availability heuristic. What is the representativeness heuristic? Nope. But you got to. There's something that you're missing here. What makes it the heuristic? Not what she said. You're on the right path, but now you finish it, okay? Making the decision. We make a decision regarding what? Yeah, okay. You're right. Let's make that more succinct, though, okay? You're right. We judge the likelihood of something based upon how similar it is to what? Our prior knowledge, our experience, our expectations of that concept, right? That's what the representativeness heuristic is. Representativeness means how similar an event is to our expectations. The representativeness heuristic is that we use that representativeness as a piece of information when making a decision. Does that make sense? It's what we want to clarify. I don't want to say, you can't say the representativeness heuristic is just determining how similar something is to our expectation. There you go. It's that the representativeness heuristic is using that information of similarity to influence our decision. Does that make sense? Just like availability heuristic is not just judging how easily something comes to mind. The availability heuristic is using how easily something comes to mind as the piece of information that drives that decision. Does that make sense? All right? So you need to be clear on that. What we mean by a heuristic is that it's a rule of thumb for making a decision. And we have a variety of different heuristics, one of which is availability, that the rule of thumb for making a decision is, hey, we're going to judge the likelihood of this by how easily I can bring relevant examples to mind. Or in representativeness, I'm going to judge the likelihood of something based upon how similar it is to my expectations. Does that make sense? No? 8 o'clock rough again? Because this is, I got you, right? But, yeah, Jessica. I don't think we use that example for representativeness heuristic. We use that example when we're talking about developing concepts. So that example was used in cognitive, but I think it was used in a different, in addressing, yeah, it is, because we're talking about, and that's where we say representativeness and availability are all based in what cognitive process? It's decision making, but really it's based in what? Memory, right? So these are memory-based processes, okay? So that's why it seems similar, right? Because your memory, your expectations about the world is what type of memory, those that took cognitive? Semantic memory, right? And so that example that we used of developing the concept of what a dog is semantic memory. So therefore, of course, it's going to be similar to using representativeness because representativeness relies on semantic memory, okay? But I don't want you to get don't confuse that example with what we mean by the representativeness heuristic, okay? Now, it would fit in there if I'm making a judgment of how likely is this new creature to be a dog, my understanding of what it is to be a dog is going to influence that. Does that make sense? Because I have to compare how similar this new creature is with this representation I have, my expectation of what it is to be a dog. Does that make sense? An example that might be related to this, I mentioned it in here, I think at the beginning of the quarter, the chupacabra. Right? Did we talk about this in class? How they found the chupacabra, and you guys know what the chupacabra is? It's like Bigfoot. Okay? It's not like Bigfoot. They're completely different animals or mythical creatures, but it's a mythical creature like Bigfoot. Okay? And the chupacabra is a mythical creature from the southern U.S. and Mexico. Hence the name. Okay? And it's this mythical creature that goes out there and just slaughters wildlife. Goats, cows, things like that. Okay? That's the idea of it. And it's a bloodsucker, right? It's like this vampire thing. And just like Bigfoot, there's been purported sightings of the chupacabra. Okay? But nobody ever has one, right? But they all kind of have the same idea of what this creature is. Okay? It's this almost hairless creature. It's small. You know, it's these red eyes on it and teeth and fangs and things of this sort, right? And if anybody's from the East Coast, it's very similar in description to what's referred to as the Jersey Devil. Okay? But we have this idea. Well, a month and a half ago, somebody caught a chupacabra in Texas. They caught one. And there's pictures of it. Go look up online. Pictures of the chupacabra, the Texas chupacabra. Okay? And so now we have this new creature, and we're sitting there saying, what the hell is this thing? And many people are sitting there saying it's a chupacabra. But then they brought in like Department of Fish and Wildlife in Texas who said, no, that's not really a chupacabra. It's a raccoon with mange. So it was hairless, right? Because it lost all of its hair, right? But a hairless raccoon might look a lot like this hairless chupacabra. Does that make sense, right? But the point here being that it's my representation of what a raccoon is like. Does that make sense? Which is going to influence my similarity assessment of how likely is this to be a chupacabra versus a raccoon with mange, right? And the people who are Department of Fish and Wildlife, have you guys ever seen a raccoon with mange? You have now? You just looked it up online, right? I've never seen a raccoon with mange before this, if this actually was a raccoon with mange, okay, right? So we don't have the representation in our head of what this animal should look like. So for us, we're going to judge similarity. Maybe it's more likely to be a chupacabra because it's more similar to our expectation of what a chupacabra is. Whereas Department of Fish and Wildlife, they've probably seen quite a few animals with mange. And so they have this representation of what a hairless raccoon will look like, and they can make their similarity assessment based upon that. Does that make sense? All right? But that's what we're relying on here, is our assessment of similarity is what's leading to our judgment. And we used this example last class, right? And what was the problem that we uncovered with this example? Right? It's not impossible, but it's statistically, it's statistically less possible, right? But yet, at the beginning of the quarter, 77% of you picked B as being more likely than A. But rationally, that's not appropriate, right? Now, all of you in this class have done what? And I can say this definitively because it was a requirement to get into this class. You've taken statistics, right? You're all fairly, compared to the rest of the population, right? You're all more sophisticated than the rest of the population, right? You're all more statistically sophisticated and savvy compared to the rest of the population. And I can know this because I tried to explain some basic statistic principle to my wife this weekend who had to do something for work. And it made me really realize and value the level of knowledge that you guys have. Right? And I don't mean that in a negative. Oh no, she understands it. She's not comfortable with statistics, and this is the basic principle of how to figure out proportions, right? And if her boss wanted her to come up with some sales rate, okay, how many of these products are you selling per 1,000 transactions? It's not that difficult of a thing to do. I guarantee you, probably at least 70% of you in the room could do it right off the bat, and the other 30% would just be quickly reminded of it and say, "Oh yeah, that's how we do it," right? Because you've taken stats. It took me probably 45 minutes to explain this concept to her, right? So you guys are very statistically sophisticated individuals, all right? So you shouldn't fall victim to this type of stuff. But we see that you do, right? This is that conjunction fallacy. We didn't get to this last class, but this is what I want to point out over here, is that what do you notice about all of these patterns right here? What's that? Exactly. Right? So it's saying and that's demonstrating what? Now what we're pointing out here is this is a little bit confusing because the low value means that people are viewing it as more likely. Does that make sense? Look at the scale over here. So 1 means very likely, 7 means very unlikely. Okay, so a lower value means that people are judging it more likely. But what do we see? What's the basic finding that we're seeing here? First thing, that what are people judging to be more likely? The bank teller feminist is more likely than the bank teller. That's what people are judging. Does that make sense? Because low values mean more likely. So what we're demonstrating here is something that's referred to as the conjunction fallacy. That we judge the combination of two events as being more likely than their independent occurrence. And we demonstrated last class that that is what? I don't want to say crap. Yeah, well, that's one we could say it's statistically impossible. Okay, the combination of two events cannot be greater than the occurrence of any one of those two events. It cannot be. That's what's impossible. It can be equal to, but it cannot be greater than. Okay? But we see that we get this consistent finding that people judge the combination as being greater than the independent occurrence. This is what we call that conjunction fallacy. All right? But what's the other thing that we notice here? Not just that people are judging this, but we have three different groups here. What are those three groups? You could maybe perceive that, but one thing I'll sit here and say is these are not, like the blues are not different from one another across groups, and the whites are not different from one another across groups. Even though this might perceive to be a difference, that difference isn't significant difference. Okay? So basically what we're seeing here is that they don't view this as being judged to be less probable than this group. Okay? This difference is not a statistically reliable difference. Okay? But what are we seeing here? Right? That the conjunction fallacy is this error in which we're not sensitive to probability theory. And what we find here is that you would expect that people that don't know a damn thing about probability theory would fall victim to this, or would be likely to fall victim to this, right? Does that make sense? If you don't know a damn thing about statistics, how can you be sensitive to statistics? Right? But what we see here is not just that. We would expect it there, but we see it up here too. Right? Showing how strong this heuristic is. That even people who know a whole lot about statistics use it and fall victim to it and make this conjunction fallacy, right? The nuclear war question. They make this error even though they know that it should be statistically impossible for this conjunction to be greater than the independent probability of one of the two events. Right? We still make that error. In the book, they talk about, I don't remember what the author's name is or the person that they reference, but some of these people, and this happened, you guys ever see this, have this happen to you? Right? Where you sit there and you learn something and you know a lot about it, but then you still fall victim to it, and you catch yourself falling victim to it, and you're just like, son of a bitch! Right? In the book, they talk about that, of people sitting there and saying, I know all about this. I do research on this stuff. I'm really aware of this. And then you sit there and you just realize, damn it, I fell victim to this. Right? Yeah.
Curiously, the best one is the fundamental attribution theory. I mean, I know about it, but it still happens. Someone cuts me off and still like, you're a jackass.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, you sit there, fundamental attribution error. You think other people's actions are more about their character than the environment, right? Whereas we think that our actions are more influenced by the environment than our character, right? So if we cut somebody off, it's, I'm still a good person, I was just late for work. If somebody cuts me off, what an asshole, right? Does that make sense? Right? That's the fundamental attribution error. But we still make that even though we're fully aware of it, right? We can see some of the famous people in social psychology. Petty and Cacioppo developed the elaboration likelihood model, if anybody remembers that from social psych, okay? And it's one of these models in which talks about how we persuade people, okay? And so they've done a ton of research on this, and I've fallen victim of this as well. Yeah. What's that? Well, no, those are different persuasion compliance techniques. Persuasion is changing people's attitudes, okay? Compliance is getting people to do things, okay? But you can find that you're falling victim to these things even though you know full well about them. Like, to use an example of that is, I know all about the foot in the door in the face, all of these compliance techniques. We use them. When I teach social psych, I make you guys, if anybody took social psych with me, I made you go out and go into a sales environment in which people were using these techniques and then try to identify the use of them. Because I always like using the G.I. Joe saying of knowing is half the battle. Okay? If you can see these things occurring, you're less likely to be influenced by them. But you still can make those errors even though you know full well that it's happening. I think I mentioned in here, like, you're going to get alumni phone calls here. Right? Those that are graduating next month, in July, you'll start getting phone calls asking you to donate things. Right? Or they'll start mailing you stuff, right? And those sons of bitches use these techniques, and you find yourself falling victim to them, and all of a sudden you're just like, wait, why am I wanting to give them things? Because they'll use the door in the face of sitting there, and they'll call you up and say, well, we're wondering if you'd be able to donate $500. Just be like, I just graduated. I don't even have a job yet. Like, we understand that. Okay. Well, you think you could do maybe $20? Right? And people are like, yeah, $20 is reasonable. And then you're just like, some bitch, they got me. Right? It's the same thing here, is that we know, even when we're statistically sophisticated, we can sit there and say in our head, this isn't statistically likely, but I got to go with it anyway. Because it's just too good. Right? There's no way that we're just going to get into some random nuclear war with Russia. But we're definitely more likely to get into a nuclear war with Russia if Pakistan gets us involved in it, or the Ukraine right now. Right? Because it makes sense to us. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit, but I want to bring it up here as an explanation of the conjunction fallacy, which similarity influences this. Okay? So here's the cognitive process of this representativeness heuristic. All right? We're going to go through this briefly, and then we're going to finish up here with talking about representativeness and move on to explanation-based approaches. Okay? So in this, the first thing happens in which we're presented with this new case. All right? I'm going to change up colors so it looks easier, okay? So we're presented with this new case or instance. All right? We get this list of features, the Linda the bank teller problem, the nuclear war with Russia problem. Okay? We get this new case, right? And that gets presented to us, and we start to generate kind of like this feature list of, okay, what are all the things that comprise this new situation? All right? And then my next step here is that I retrieve this concept of what the category is. Nuclear war with Russia. Feminist bank tellers. All right? And when we retrieve that concept of that category, I'm retrieving basically a list of features that respond to that. Does that make sense? So now I have two lists. What are those two lists that I have? Nope, we don't have similarities yet. Okay? We have two lists. What are those two lists? A description list and a representation list. What is the description list? The description list is the list of features that correspond to what? No. The item, the event, right? The new thing, the new case or instance. I have a list of things that correspond to what that is. So it could be a list of traits of Linda the bank teller. Right? It could be the 3 rolls of a die, going all the way back to one of the early examples we did. It could be nuclear war with Russia, right? It's a list of features that correspond to that, the new case that I have. That's one list. What's the other list I have? I don't want to say what you think is similar because that's a next step. All right? It's the list of your memory of what? Bank tellers. Or of the category or concept that is being activated by this, right? I have a list of Linda, what she's like. And now I'm going to generate a list of what a bank teller is like. Does that make sense? I'll generate a list of what a feminist is like. Does that make sense, right? I'll have these lists going. One list that is, what is this to be judged object or event or person? Another list of what are the concepts that I'm activating. And then what do I do next? I have these lists. That's when I compare them for what? For similarities, okay? That's the third step. All right? So the first is I develop this feature list of the case. The second one is I recall what it means to be a member of the category. Right? What does it mean in my mind to be a bank teller? What does it mean in my mind to be a feminist? Does that make sense? Right? And in some cases, I'll retrieve specific category members. What would that be an example of? What am I using there? Old bank tellers that I know. And if I'm retrieving examples from memory, availability. So there's even a role for availability in the representativeness heuristic. I'm going to retrieve examples from memory. That will help me determine what it means to be a member of that category. Does that make sense? And so now I might have multiple lists going. My to be judged list, and I'll draw a diagram here in a second that I hope clarifies it, okay? And then my list of what each category member should have. What it means to be a bank teller, what it means to be a feminist. And then I do my third step of, now I'm going to go through, I'm going to start comparing the case with the concept. And I'm seeing, this is what I have. This is that new object, person, event. These are the characteristics of it. And I'm comparing this list of characteristics with these various categories that I have. The list of characteristics of what it means to be in that category. All right? And then I determine how many matches or mismatches there are in these categories. And then I'll estimate the likelihood of category membership based upon how well of a match it is to those lists. So here, let me try to draw it here and see if we can get something here. All right? So let's start off with, let's use the Linda the bank teller example. Okay? Because it's just easier to understand. So what's the first list that I'm going to have? A feature list of what? Of Linda. Not of a bank teller, but of Linda. Right? So I'm going to have this feature list here of Linda. Somebody want to give me, what are some of the features of Linda? Somebody that has the book open or can look back at the notes. That way I don't have to pull it up on here because it would be difficult to do. So 31. Does it say that she's an activist? Single. Outspoken. Very bright. Philosophy major. I'm just going to put discrimination and social justice. It's nuclear. It's nuclear, not nuclear, okay? Some people have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's okay. I like to make myself laugh, okay? Anti-nuclear, okay? Anything else? No? Okay. So, this is what? That's a description list. That's the feature list of the to-be-judged object, right? What step is that? Well, 2. Step 1 is being presented. Step 2 is generating the list. Right? Does that make sense? So that's the first step. Or the second step, excuse me. Okay? That's the second step. We're presented with Linda, and then I sit there in my mind, I come up with this feature list of what Linda is. And for this example, it's really easy because it's given right to me. Okay? So now I have this feature list of Linda. And now I have to start developing what? What's that? Representation list of the various categories. right? And what are the various categories that I need to construct a representation list of? Teachers, bank teller, bookstore employee that takes yoga classes, right? Does that make sense? I have to start generating these feature lists there for every of the categories that I'm presented with as options. Does that make sense? So let's come up here and let's just do, what's one of those categories? Teacher. That's independent. Feminist is independent. Okay, and that's just the single one, right? Okay. So feminist, social worker, right? Bank teller on its own, right? Does that make sense? Right? What's one of the other ones? Insurance, okay, right? And so I would construct then a list in my memory of different features that correspond to teacher. Right? A different list of features that correspond to a feminist. A different list of social workers. A different list of bank tellers. A different list of insurance salesmen. Does that make sense? Right? And then I'm just going to sit there and I'm going to compare this list with the list I've generated to see how similar they are. Right? And I'm going to find here, and we're going to do an example of this with the two lists of importance here in a second. Okay? I'm going to find doing this that, you know what? There's really not a lot of match between Linda and an insurance salesman. In my expectation of what an insurance salesman is. So she's not likely to be an insurance salesman. Right? But maybe there's more match between Linda and a feminist or Linda and a social worker. So I'm going to say she's more likely to be one of these than these. Right? But let's take a step back for a second. Let's put up the ones that were... the ones that were of interest to see how can we make this conjunction error. So really the error that we're noticing here is an error in which we think Linda is more likely to be what? A bank teller feminist compared to what? Just a bank teller. Okay? So let's start off with bank teller. Give me a list of features that you think a bank teller has. Smart. Good. I'm just going to put good money because I heard that. And then good numbers too, right? Think bank tellers are good looking? Really?
I think they are.
Yeah? Hot. Okay. Never heard of that one, but okay. All right. Any other characteristics? Organized. Robotic. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So yeah, bank tellers usually are female, right? Okay. So female. Interactive. Smiling. Do you think that they're conservative at all? Well, this somebody who likes money usually is somebody who's kind of conservative with money. No? That's my mindset of a bank teller. I kind of view bank tellers and librarians to be kind of similar. Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. Librarian-ish. Okay. Right? But let's just say that's our list of what it is, and it could be a lot more. Okay? Could be a lot more. All right? But now let's look here to say, what do we think a bank teller feminist is going to be like? Now, it's going to have some of these same characteristics, right? What characteristics that are on this list do you think would be bank teller feminist?
Female.
What's that? Female, definitely. Well, but isn't a bank teller going to be employed too? Oh, okay, so career driven? Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Do you think a feminist is going to be what? You think hot? Really? I don't know about that. I see a lot of head shaking here. Yeah? Okay, so some of us are going to... I know some are, but I'm just saying, we're talking about stereotypes. Now you're bringing up examples, right? Okay. What? Single? You think feminists are going to be more likely to be single than not married and having the man keep them down? Right? Okay. Right? Single? Maybe do you think that a feminist is more likely to be interested in social issues? Okay. Yeah, did we already? I thought we already had. We don't have smart on here. Okay. Hippie-like. We don't need to agree on the specific things, okay? But my point here on this is that, and then they're going to have some of these other characteristics, right? Are they going to have some of them? We already said female, right? But do we think that they're also going to probably be organized, good with money, good with numbers? Right? Do you think that? Good number, good money. I know I'm getting sloppy now, but that's because I'm just trying to get to the point here of this, okay? Is that then, oops, let me try that again. Now we're going to have our just two categories, but realize we'd have this for all of them. Now I'm going to do what? What's the next step? I'm going to compare, right? And let's compare just by using different colors here. So on this first list, how many of these, well, obviously, we should have female here, right? Well, that matches up, right? Smart, that matches up, right? Does anything else here match up with our description of what a bank teller should be? I think interactive meant that, because you brought up interactive, right? I took interactive to mean just like kind of a social person, like they're customer service oriented, that type of interactive, right? Not like introverted and. But it would be representing a different concept than what was the concept that was proposed initially. Okay, the interactive as it was proposed meant that they were customer service oriented, not that they were that type of thing. Okay? Now, if we want to change what we mean by the term, that's a different thing. Or if we want to put in now a different expectation of what a bank teller is. But do we think bank tellers are going to be socially active people? We don't think that they might not be, but it's not a classic description of what a bank teller is. Although public defender, would we sit there and say they're more likely to be concerned with issues of social justice? Right? So that's what I mean by this. It's not saying that they can't be, but it's saying, is that associated with our concept of what that occupation is? Okay? But we really only see two there, right? Let's take a look here and let's look at the other one. How many of the other ones do we see? Right? Social justice, right? Oops. Social justice, right? Which that might actually go with the hippie-like thing, right? Single, right? Point here, why are we judging her more likely to be this than this? Exactly, because our understanding, our representation of what a bank teller feminist is more similar to that feature list we have of Linda than just what a bank teller is. So even though it's statistically impossible that she's more likely to be this than this, our perception is that she's more likely to be this than this because what she is matches better with our expectation of that category than the other one. That's the process of the representativeness heuristic. It might not be rational. It violates probability theory. But who gives a shit? Look at it. Just look. It's irrational not to think she's a bank teller feminist. Right? Is there something funny there? I know. That's called being tired, okay? Right? But my point here being, this is what the approach is. This is why, part of the reason why, it makes a lot of sense for us, even though we're statistically sophisticated, to sit there and say, I know it's not probable, and it's statistically impossible for it to be more likely, but in this specific instance, if I had to put money on it, where am I putting my money? Why? Because it's more similar to, right? Even though the smart money goes where? Bank teller, right? Our dumb money goes to bank teller feminist. All right? So, the question for you then is judging by similarity a bad thing? And I guess the question that comes up here should be what? Well, the question above that, because I put it up there, is what do we mean by bad? Right? If we limit it to, is it rational versus irrational, is it a bad thing if that's what we mean? Is it irrational to judge on the basis of similarity? What do you think? Yeah? Think so? How many say it's irrational to judge on the basis of similarity? To use the representativeness heuristic. Is the representativeness heuristic an irrational heuristic? Yeah? That was definitive. How many say it's irrational? How many say it's rational? A lot of you didn't put your hands up. Why didn't you put your hands up? Why didn't you put your hands up? Some people didn't put their hands up, period. So why didn't you put your hands up? Okay, so maybe some people didn't put their hands up. It's not listening, okay? Other people, though, might sit there and say, which is the bane of all psychology, I hate it, it depends. All right? I hate hearing it depends. But that's what you're saying, right? It depends. Right? I don't want to say black or white, that it's rational or irrational, because it depends. What would it depend on? Context? Okay. So maybe it depends upon the significance of the judgment to be made, whether it's personal interest, right? Whether it really matter if it's a raccoon or a chupacabra. Okay. Do you really give a damn? Some people do, right? Some people like fight to death about that, right? Okay. Other people are just like, why does it matter? Okay. Does it really matter? Life's too short, man. Just move on. Okay. So maybe it depends. Maybe it's irrational for something that is important, but it's rational for something that is just good enough. Yeah? Think so? What's going to make a determination of this? If we want to say if it's rational or irrational, what do we need to focus on? Like, what do we mean by rationality, right? Just like to say, is it bad? We have to clarify what we mean by it, right? And if we just focus on it being rational, right, it leads to technically incorrect responses. Linda cannot be more likely to be a bank teller feminist than just a bank teller, right? It's technically incorrect. However, we can rationalize things after the fact, right? Go back to that description of Jack early on. Or Linda is really likely to be a feminist. That's rationalizing it, right? Or if we go to war with Russia, it's likely going to be the result of a situation involving some third country that's presently in a state of turmoil. Right? We can rationalize it. So it depends on what we mean by rational. Right? If we mean rational is purely on the basis of probability theory, then yeah, it's irrational. But if we say if we rationalize things afterwards, we can make it appear to be rational anyway. Right? The other question, though, then is, well, is it problematic? That's a different type of bad, right? Does it result in problems? What problems? Stereotypes? Assumptions? Sure, we might be inaccurate, right? But judging on the basis of similarity produces what? If we judge on the basis of a similarity of something we already know, what are we in essence doing? Exactly, right? We talked about the inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is developing this idea about a group from a few instances. And then deductive reasoning is applying traits to a newly encountered thing based upon knowledge of the larger. Right? Stereotyping. Okay. If we judge new instances on the basis of similarity, which is what the representativeness heuristic is, right? What does that sound a hell of a lot like? Not stereotyping. Stereotyping is our expectations of a group. There's actually judge in it. Prejudging people, right? Prejudice is actually using the representativeness heuristic. We're judging people based upon our expectations of their group membership. Are we not? Which that can lead then, that prejudging. What's the difference between stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination? Stereotype is a belief. Exactly. Okay. So prejudice is what? Kind of, but not really. Yeah, it's negative. But prejudice is, I know you're going back to social psych when you say affect, okay? Prejudice is what? What? It's thought, but it is, what's this whole damn course about? Judgment. Prejudice is a judgment. Decision making, okay? I'm pointing back, yeah. Yeah. I'm not, yeah. I'm pointing to the slides, okay? Yeah, I don't know, yeah. I guess I should clarify what that is, right? What is he doing up here? Is he having a stroke? No. Stereotypes are our beliefs. It's our cognition. It's our memory. Prejudice is the judgment that's influenced by that memory, that cognition, our beliefs, right? And then discrimination is the action that results from that judgment. Right? Now, typically, discrimination is, well, not typically. We define prejudice and discrimination as negative. Right? So if we have a stereotype of something positive, we don't call it prejudice if we assume that that person has that positive characteristic. Does that make sense? Prejudice, by definition, is a negative belief about something or a negative judgment of somebody based upon your belief. Okay? Discrimination is a negative action towards somebody based upon your judgment of that individual. Does that make sense? Right? But this similarity stuff, this representativeness heuristic, although it can be a positive thing, it can be rational, it can be fast and efficient for us, just like all heuristics, it can lead to these errors. We're going to cover a lot more on this when we get to chapter 8. Because people are going to argue that in the long run, these are good things to do. Right? But we can see some examples in which they'll be problematic. We'll talk about that more in chapter 8. All right? Any questions on this? On representativeness? No? All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to introduce explanation-based judgments and really focus our attention on the story model and go through that. And at the end of today's class, you're going to be able to write a thesis on the story model. Okay? All right, let's take a break. So in the future, should I not schedule this class at 8 a.m.?
Definitely 1:30.
Is it really that tough? I think I'm gonna have to send out a survey to you guys. That way you can respond anonymously. Because I can't judge whether this is a 8 a.m. issue, whether it's an 8 a.m. in combination with the material, or whether it's whether I'm sucking right now in the presentation to you guys. It's the material is dense. Yeah, I know. It's not me, it's you. No, I'm fabulous. You're the problem, right? That's it.
Class I would want at 8 a.m. and be engaged in.
What's that? Yeah. Well, but I'm going back in the memory class. When I teach that at 8 a.m., it's not this quiet in that class at 8 a.m. And that's why I'm wondering if it's a combination of the material with the time, if it's a combination of I'm failing to clarify these points to you well enough. I'm trying to get a feel for it. Yeah, it could always be something unique about the sample, too. But I'm trying to figure out how to improve the course, right, to maximize it. So, I'm looking for problems with the course or things that I can control. I can't control you, right? Yeah, but I'm not quite allowed to do that. Right? You guys aren't rats. I can't get the permission to do that. So you took this one, not even caring about the content of this course, just. Yeah, I'm going to send you guys out a survey here to ask for your anonymous feedback on it to see if there's things that we can do to try to make the last month of this class a bit more, more engaging, or to figure out something here to make it a bit more two-way, I guess is a way to describe it.
It'd also be cool if it's at 1:30 because then you have like your whole day of things that you like see and pick up on and like, oh, that teacher made a horrible decision or my friend did, and then you can bring it to class versus just waking up and coming to class and having to remember like last week that was so long ago.
Okay, I guess. Bringing example. Yeah, I mean, I guess I see what you're saying of things being, although things that you did at the end of last night should be really fresh in your mind early in the morning because you didn't have interference effects, right? That's why studying right before you go to sleep can actually enhance learning because you don't have interference immediately afterwards, right? So there's pros and cons to both of those. Maybe the topic just sucks. Maybe you guys really don't care about judgment and decision making. Maybe that's it. I do that in other classes. I give pop quizzes. My thing is I don't think you're not reading. So the pop quizzes wouldn't help because I don't think it's an issue of not having read the material. I'm curious if it's an issue of, the other thing about the course is it the book? Does the book suck? So much. I know, it is. The problem is it isn't specific enough. It's too general of a reader for a course textbook, right? I mean, and is the book just a difficult book to grasp? Is the language, because I know Hasty is a bit of a, is the book a problem? No? Sometimes it drags on. Like the coverage of the story model in the book, in this whole stuff on explanation based, I'm going to try to give you the short, much easier to understand version of it. Because that's easy. That to me is easy to understand. The article I gave you guys, I think the first few pages of that do a better job of explaining the story model than what they do in the textbook. That's why I gave you that and said focus on that rather than the text. All right, but if you have thoughts on it, if it's the book, I'm going to send you guys a survey to try to figure out, because obviously I don't want you guys to have a book in which it's just so difficult to grasp the material, okay? All right. Well, I'm not getting a lot of feedback from you guys. When I ask questions, I feel like there's a lot of quietness and a lot of uncertainty of what the correct answer is, right? And so to me, it's a concern that you're not grasping the material very well. And so grasping the material could be related to either the material is difficult to grasp, the book is not doing a good job of presenting the material, I'm not doing a good job of presenting the material, right? So that's my concern is, are you grasping the material? Right? And when I ask a question and I get a lot of quiet, that's concerning to me about, okay, do you really get the material or not? Right? Yeah. But that's part of my reason for asking. All right? But let's move on here. Let's talk about the story model here and explanation-based judgment. So before we jump into this, somebody summarize for me, what do we mean by an explanation-based judgment? Ashley.
A judgment in which you are presenting narratives that you have components of the story where you're taking this evidence and you're kind of like tying it together so it makes sense positive.
Okay, so an explanation-based judgment is a judgment based upon some narrative I've created of this event. Does that make sense? All right, that's what we mean by an explanation-based judgment. It's making a judgment as to what's more likely, what's better quality, what likely occurred versus didn't occur, say, for example, in a jury sense. All right? I'm making these judgments based upon constructing some story, some narrative of everything that I know. And then I make a judgment based upon that story that I've constructed. All right, that narrative that I've constructed. Okay? So you guys remember these? This was from all the way back when we talked about probability theory. Right? This one we just went over just now. Right? What was the key thing about both of these? What was the outcome? Which of these did we judge more likely of the first one? Yeah, we judged A as being more likely than B, and which of these do we judge to be more likely? B is more likely than A. What is the problem with both of them? It's not that it's dead wrong. We don't want to say dead wrong, okay? But what's the problem with it? Right? It violates rationality. Okay, let's not say it's dead wrong, but it violates principles of rationality of probability theory, right? So the question is, why do we view these rationally less probable events as more probable? Because we like stories. So we like stories, and there's more information where things link together better for us, right? What's another reason that we explained this one? Okay, so here we're given reasons. We've developed a story here, okay? That's one reason. We have a better explanation. What did we just talk about was another explanation for this. Similarity between the two. What do we call that? The representativeness heuristic is one explanation of this. But there can be another explanation of this, which is the narrative aspect, right? The fact that this one provides a more coherent story with plausible causal links, right? It's not plausible that somebody becomes a drug addict and wins a championship. That causal link there isn't obvious, right? But the causal link between drug addict entering treatment, then becoming a champion, that we see that causal component there, right? Nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia. Well, now we have to construct these stories here and develop what could do it, whereas here, it's given to us. This is the causal link, and it seems more obvious and plausible to us, therefore that's going to be the chosen, more likely option. All right? What we're getting at here is the benefit of a good story. He talked about in the book, they've quoted him a few times, the guy Stephen Gould, right? Who describes us as a storytelling primate. What does he mean by this? I know you can read. Okay? I don't want you to read what it means, okay? What do we mean by being a storytelling primate? Right? Okay, so it's not just that we like telling stories, but that we use stories to what? Right? To explain life around us, right? To understand what's going on, to explain our past, right? We like to organize things. We're a creature that likes to organize things, find links between things, right? Remember we talked before about need for cognition? Right? We talked about that. We said individuals will differ in their need for cognition, but one of the basic findings we have is we kind of all like to have like closure and to understand things. Some people like to think more than others, but just generally speaking, as humans, we like to be able to explain things. We don't like loose ends, right? And stories are a way for us to develop those explanations, right? We have a bias to constructing stories. We bring in events that we know, and then what do? We explain it with a story. And if there's a certain piece of information missing, what do? We fill in the blank with what we expect to go there. Right? We do. We make it up. We fill in the blanks with our expectations. Okay? That constructs and represents our entire world around us. Things we hear from other people. Expectations of the future. Remembering the past. It's all about using what we know and filling in the blanks with what we expected to have occurred or what will occur in order to develop this understanding and this causal link between events in our life. Okay? And so this causality is the glue that binds different events together. All right? We all like a good story. And then we use these stories in many aspects. We use these stories in memory processes. We use these stories in problem solving. We use these stories in understanding language, just comprehension, right? We use it in a variety of contexts, but we also use it in the judgment and decision-making process as well. Okay? So let's look back here at this conjunction fallacy again. Remember last time we talked about it a few moments ago, we talked about what the conjunction fallacy was, but the key thing here was this finding here. What I wanted you to focus on, which is why then does the conjunction fallacy still occur in statistically sophisticated individuals? Because the story makes more sense. Because it's not about probability theory. It's demonstrating the bias to using narratives in our cognition. The story makes a hell of a lot more sense when it's a bank teller feminist than just a bank teller. Right? And that's what these explanation-based approaches are looking at here. Okay? It's not about stats, it's about what makes sense. And so now the question that we're going to ask here is then, well, how do we go about doing this? How do we go about constructing these stories? How do we go about using these stories? Okay? So, here are the cognitive processes of this explanation-based judgment. And we're going to spend a little bit of time going through this now, but we're going to spend the bulk of our time today clarifying the story model. Going through that, and we're going to see how that all relates to these general processes. So the story model focuses specifically in judgment in one specific context. What's that context? Jurors, okay, in court cases. This is a general process for all explanation-based judgments. So we're going to see how the story model fits into this general process. But certain aspects of the story model we're not going to use when making a judgment about the nuclear war question. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's why I want to make sure I'm creating that distinction there. The story model applies specifically to the context of juror decision making. This process explains basically all explanation-based judgments. All right? So the first question, or the first step here is considering the evidence. What do we mean by that? Okay? But what do we mean by evidence that we have? The facts that are presented. Okay? Does evidence mean like in a criminal case? No, not always, right? It can be, right? But when we say evidence, we're not trying to link this to crime or a court case. We're saying evidence. Give me an example of evidence from the Linda the bank teller problem. That she's outspoken. She's 31. She's single. Does that make sense? That's all the evidence there, okay? We evaluate the facts that we're presented with. And why are facts in quotation marks? Right, okay, because fact, the term fact suggests reality, right? What actually happened, right? But facts are the evidence, the information we're provided, but they may not be true. Okay, but we perceive them to be true. That's the key thing, okay? So then I get all these facts, all this information, and then what's the next thing I do? I start to put it together to try to make some sort of explanation for all of this evidence that I have, all of these facts that I have. All right? I create a narrative or multiple stories that attempt to account for all of this evidence that I've acquired this so far. So an explanation-based judgment could be also in the Linda the bank teller. I create a story that tries to account for what Linda is. Right? I create a story of what Linda is. And then from there, I draw an inference. What does that mean? Yeah, but what do we mean by drawing an inference? Is it simply guessing? What's the difference between guessing and what Ashley just said? Not that it doesn't imply that there aren't any facts, but guessing implies what? Yeah, that you're not using some sort of reasoned process to get there, right? If I guess, what am I doing? Just pulling something out randomly, right? Does that make sense, right? So I'm just going to guess what the correct result is. Right? I have no clue. I'm just going to guess. You guys have done this on multiple choice tests before, right? Okay. Guessing is, I have no clue. I know it's got to be one of these four responses. I don't know, C. Right? That's guessing. There you go. Inference is sitting there and working with it more, coming up with a reasoned judgment of it, okay? So drawing an inference isn't just guessing what the correct response is, but it's using some sort of cognitive process to sit there and infer what the best response is going to be. We choose the story that is the most reasonable to us. So I have Linda the bank teller, or Linda the bank teller feminist. And I sit there and say, well, it's a lot more reasonable for her to be a bank teller feminist than just a bank teller. Right? I have nuclear war with Russia. It's a lot more reasonable that we're going to get into a nuclear war with Russia caused by some third country than it is to just get into a nuclear war with Russia. Does that make sense? I have these different narratives, and now I'm comparing them. And then after I choose the one that is the most reasonable, so there's a kind of this decision process is kind of a two-step process. The first thing I do is, after I've constructed all of my stories, I sit there and say, which of this group of stories I have is the most reasonable? And I've decided, okay, this one's the most reasonable. Then I sit there and say, okay, how much confidence do I have that that story is the best decision? The best explanation. Yeah. It could go into that. Okay, so yeah, it could go into how the number of reasons. I may only focus on 3 to 5 reasons, right? I may only pay attention to that, but I'm more likely if I have 5 reasons in one story versus 1 in another, which one is going to be more confident? 5, right? Okay, so that's one of the things there that we'll do, but that's going to be more in this inferring the decision, the alternative that there's the most reasons for. Now here, I come down here and I say, okay, I've determined at this step, what's the best story? What's the best narrative I have to explain these events? Now, how much confidence do I have in that story? Then I'm just going to focus only on that story now to determine how good of a job does that story do at explaining the facts. That would be done at this stage. Okay? That would be done at inferring the decision. At this stage, at stage 3 here, that's the stage in which I'm deciding which story does the best job. Then after I've decided that this is the best story, I then make a judgment, okay, how much confidence do I have in this story? Okay? But I've determined which does the best story at the earlier step. Okay, now I'm just looking at, okay, this is the best one, how good is it? And going from there. All right? And then I'll report my decision and my confidence afterwards. But those are the steps of an explanation based. Really the key thing here then is what's going on here that influences how we construct a story. And then how do we go about assessing and comparing stories? Right? Those are the questions that we want to focus on here. All right? So quickly, I'm just going to go through a couple ways in which these explanations can lead to irrationality, and then we're going to talk about the story model here. Okay? Now, I've consciously made a decision here to start using different words than what the book uses to A, get you to think about it in different ways, but then also B, to force you to think right now, what do I mean by the automaticity of causality? Because if I use the phrase that was used in the book, you could just read it. You wouldn't have to think about it. Okay? So what do I mean by the automaticity of causality? The first reason why explanations can lead to irrational, according to probability theory, irrational decisions or judgments. Let's just break it down. What does automaticity suggest? It's automatic. What does causality suggest? Okay, so the cause of something is automatic. What does that mean? So what is the cause of what? What are we talking about here? What is automatic? No, I'm not asking for the definition of what automatic is. I'm asking you for what are we saying is automatic here? Not certain decisions. Our explanations or our bias for what? No, this is in constructing a story, not in choosing a story, in constructing a story. Kind of. Yeah. It's saying that we have a bias for what? What is our bias? We talked about this already. We're getting too far. We talked about it like 5 minutes ago. This is where I'm saying, like, this is in the textbook. This is clearly written about in the textbook. Well, I don't want to say it's clearly, right? But it's definitively written in there. And that's why I'm struggling here to say, okay, is the text just not easy to grasp? Right? They talk specifically in the text about something that causality being an automatic thing. What do they mean by that? Okay, yeah. We search for what? We automatically search for what in our world? Cause and meaning. All right? That's what we mean by that. There's automaticity in causality, right? We tend to automatically look for causal links between events. We don't just let events occur. But every time we see two events, we tend to want to see what? A cause there. We're going to see this later on when we talk about, remember, we've already mentioned before, illusory correlations, right? We sit there and we see examples of somebody commit a crime with mental illness, and what do we assume? That the mental illness caused them to commit the crime. Right? And then we get these illusory correlations of, oh, those that are mentally ill are more likely to be violent. Right? But it's a bias that we have, this automaticity of causality. We tend to automatically look for causal links between events, even if they're not there. Right? So that can lead us to irrationality because now we're perceiving things to occur to be linked that aren't actually linked. But in our story, we're saying they're linked. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the first thing. The other things that can lead to irrationality is this believability of the component events. What do I mean by component events? The single facts that I have are components that make up what? The story, right? So now the believability of the single events within the story can influence and lead to irrational decisions. Okay? There's a variety of things that can influence this. First is what we call the availability to the imagination. We talked about this when we talked about availability. That things that are easier to imagine are what? We perceive them to be what? We perceive them to be more likely to happen, right? If I can easily imagine something, I'm going to perceive that it's more likely to happen. Right? So when we see the components of an event, and we sit there and say, oh, that's the classic underdog story. It's more likely to have occurred. Does that make sense? Right? That's the prototypical story. What example did they give in the text of this? They gave two examples that were the same example, just at two different historical points. And honestly, we can probably come up with 1,000 examples of this. I can easily think of 2 additional samples or examples of this. No. Nope, not OJ. No, I want to bring it to a story, not to a specific example. They talk about this. They talk about, it's the classic Adam and Eve story. What's the classic Adam and Eve story? Man can't keep it in his pants. Something bad happens. Right? Woman corrupts man. Right? That's the classic Adam and Eve story, leading to the downfall of powerful men because they're too weak for women, right? I mean, that's basically Adam and Eve, right? Adam was this great guy. God made him a companion in Eve, right? But then Eve got him to do something bad, and it screwed us all, right? And we can see examples. That's Adam and Eve's story. And we can see examples in history of Cleopatra bringing down 2 of the greatest military heroes of all time, right? Okay? Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, right? That's an example of it there, right? I had another example. What was my third? Helen of Troy, right? It's a classic example. That wasn't even the one that I was thinking about, but Helen of Troy is a perfect example of it. And I had thought of it, and now I lost it as I'm responding to Helen of Troy, right? But we can see, the sirens, the Greek mythology of sirens, right? Luring men to their demise, right? It's the classic story of man can't keep it in pants. That's what it is, right? But because it's a classic story, it's available easily to imagine that that's an explanation for an event, so there we overestimate the likelihood of it. Does that make sense? That's one example of it. Another one here, all right? Probable events can still produce improbable conjunctions. This is a simple math thing, right? Individual events might be highly probable, but the combination of those individual events is improbable. Right? So here, we could have, how many events is this? 6 events. That all are fairly highly probable. But the combination of all those events is improbable. Right? But we view each individual event and say, that's likely, that's likely, that's likely, that's likely. This all makes sense to us. This must have happened. Right? We're not sensitive to that simple probability theory. Okay? And lastly, Improbable events may be more available for constructing future stories. Okay? What we mean by this is that something that's improbable is more likely to be what? Remembered. And if it's more likely to be remembered, it's going to be more available for a future judgment. And if it's more available, it means we're going to be more likely to what? Not just put it in our story, but make a judgment that this is more likely to occur because I was easily able to retrieve an example of it. Right? So these are all reasons as to how explanations can lead to this irrationality. But what we want to focus on here, then, is this story model of juror decision making. To look at a specific example of this, to give an idea of how do we go about constructing these stories, how do we go about using them to render a decision, in something that this isn't simply making a judgment of, is Linda a bank teller or a feminist or both? Or what's more likely, in a nuclear war with Russia or not? What is it about this context? There's a lot more implications of this, right? We're deciding in many cases the life or death of an individual. I guess I shouldn't say many, but in some cases we are deciding life or death of an individual. And regardless, in the vast majority of cases, we're deciding on that person's liberties, right? Whether they're going to be incarcerated for some period of time or not. Or we're going to take away their independence. Significant consequences to these decisions. So that's why we want to look at this here, because it's not just some flighty thing of really who gives a damn if it's Linda's a bank teller or a feminist. Right? But this matters a lot more. So let's take a look and see how do we explain how jurors are making decisions using an explanation approach. Okay? So what this model argues, again, it's explanation based. So it argues that what? Jurors are doing what? They're constructing stories, and then they're using those stories for what purpose? To make a decision about this person. And the decision in a case is what? Guilty or not guilty in a criminal case. They render a verdict. Okay, that's what we mean by decision here, okay? So what it argues is that jurors construct various stories through the active incorporation of information. They're actively constructing these stories. And then they use these stories to help them comprehend the evidence and to serve as the basis for their verdict. That's important. The stories serve two purposes. One, it helps them just understand all of this information coming in. And then once they understand all this information coming in, I then use this information to render my verdict. Use this story to render my verdict. Okay? And there's basically 3 steps here. This is from the Pennington and Hasty article. Okay? And the first step is constructing the stories, which is the top part of this model. And we're going to talk about these independently in a minute. Okay? So the first step is constructing the story and how we go about doing that. And you can see that's listed right here as constructing stories. Okay? The next step, after I've constructed a story, is I have to represent what my decision alternatives are. And what do we mean in a trial? What are the decision alternatives? Well, plea bargaining isn't done with the jury. Plea bargaining is done with the attorneys and the judge. So at this point, plea bargaining is off the table if it's going to trial. Okay? But what are the decision alternatives in a trial for a juror? Guilty or not guilty, but a lot of times it isn't even just guilty or not guilty. Well, that's a civil case, not a criminal case. Nope, we're not even talking about sentencing here. Okay, this is where, here's a little bit of information for you. Okay, what are the alternatives that jurors typically have? Jurors don't usually make sentences. Well, that's what it seems like, but really, actually, they usually have more options than just that. Right? Jurors have more options than that. That's why I'm going to clarify here so you get a little bit of knowledge here of our court system as well, okay? Jurors, the only time jurors assign sentences is in a death penalty case. Jurors don't assign sentences. That's done by a judge after the verdict. The juror's job is solely to determine guilty or not guilty. Okay? I don't want to get it confused with a civil case in which now they're assigning damage awards. That's a different thing. We're talking criminal cases here, but it does apply to civil as well. Guilty or not guilty. But they aren't just usually given one charge to make a decision on. There's usually multiple charges that the person is available or is being charged with. So, for example, one of the more famous cases recently is the Casey Anthony case. Right? Guys remember Casey Anthony? The mother that was charged with murdering her 2-year-old daughter, little Kaylee Anthony, in Florida a few years ago. And she went on trial, okay? She was essentially acquitted. I'll tell you afterwards why I think she was acquitted. Why I think she was acquitted was because the story that the prosecution constructed didn't match the evidence well. And therefore, the prosecution story was incomplete and improbable, which led to the later comparison with the verdict options. But my point being, there's different verdict categories. Casey Anthony was charged with 4 charges: murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, manslaughter, and then lying to police. She was convicted only on one of those charges, lying to police. So my point being, the second step, they have to understand what are the various options I have. It's usually not just guilty, not guilty. It's usually they're charged with multiple charges, and then they can decide for each of them whether they're guilty or not guilty. Right? So they're representing more than just one decision alternative. Okay? And then the last step here is that they take and they determine the best fit between the story that they've selected as their best story and the verdict options that are available, and they find the best fit. And they make their decision then on the match between the story I've chosen as the best representation of the evidence I have and my understanding of what the decision options are. And then I'll make my decision. And going back to the Casey Anthony case, the verdict options did not match well enough with the story the jurors constructed, hence being acquitted on man 1, on murder in the second, on murder in the first, because their understanding of what those verdicts were did not match well enough with the story they identified. And therefore they acquitted. Okay? But let's take a look at this. We'll see this in the OJ case too. But I don't like using the OJ case because I found out and realized the other day in class that the vast majority of my students weren't even born back then. I know. Well, I thought the LA riots were pretty famous too. Last Wednesday, you know what last Wednesday was? 22nd anniversary of the LA riots, based on the Rodney King verdict. In my class, over half the class never knew that there was riots in LA, and only slightly fewer didn't know anything about who Rodney King was. Very disturbing. As I watched the riots in high school, in class. And then half the class wasn't even alive then. So I went home and I drank profusely. Okay? So let's look here on understanding these steps. Okay? So we want to go through, we want to look at these 3 steps and how we go about doing this. The first of these steps is constructing a story. So let's focus on, well, how does the juror go about constructing a story and then identifying what is the best story I have. Okay? Now, what is a juror going to use to construct a story? What's that? The evidence. And what do you mean by the evidence? Right? So one thing a juror is going to use is the evidence being presented by the attorneys in court, right? So if it's a Casey Anthony case, the evidence could be that they found her car a couple months afterwards and it smelled like death in the trunk of the car. Right? That's one piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence is they found Kaylee's body in the woods not far from the house that she was living in months after the event. Right? Another piece of evidence that they harped on was the fact that little Kaylee Anthony had duct tape placed over her mouth. And on the duct tape was a little heart sticker placed on top of the duct tape afterwards. Right? And so this was evidence they presented at trial. Okay? They presented evidence of Casey Anthony drinking and partying after Kaylee was missing. right? They presented all this evidence. That's the evidence they presented. But they're not just presenting evidence. What else are they presenting? Well, but witness statements are evidence. Okay? So it's the evidence. Okay? But what else is a juror using? Similar cases. Right? Knowledge of similar cases, which would be what? Other murders. Okay? Other murders of mothers killing their kids. Right? What heuristic would? Availability, right? They're retrieving other memories or instances. Okay? And then they're also not just taking into account the evidence presented, not just taking into account other examples that they can think of, but the jurors also taking into account expectations of what makes a complete story, right? Our expectations of the world. Causal links. Searching for them. Yeah. I don't know what you're asking. Can you clarify what you're asking? Pre-trial publicity? Like pre-trial publicity? Okay. Jurors are typically chosen to not be aware of pre-trial publicity. At least that's the goal, but it's usually not the case. And you can take the psych and law class where we talk a lot more about can you unring a bell. Unring a bell. Okay? And we talk about that in psych and law a lot more about the effects of pre-trial publicity. And even though the court views it that as long as a juror says, I'll be neutral, that's good enough. It is. That's the reality of it. As long as the juror says I'll be neutral, that's good enough. But cognitively speaking, we would argue you can't unring a bell. Okay? So the juror will use that information too. Okay? Though it's not just stuff presented at trial. It could be other stuff that they knew about the case before they came into the courtroom. That could be case-specific information. Okay? But they're going to use all of these and they're going to construct various stories. And in a criminal case, how many stories at a minimum is a juror going to likely construct? 2. What are those 2 stories? What the defense and the prosecution construct for them. Right? Because that's what the whole job of an attorney is to not just present the evidence, but to present the story that explains the evidence. That's what good attorneys do. Bad attorneys just present the evidence. Good attorneys say, this is the evidence and this is the story that explains it. So at a minimum, jurors are getting 2 stories. But could they construct more than 2? Yeah. They could construct a 3rd story. They could construct a 4th story, which is, okay, why would this happen if the person was guilty? Why would this happen if the person was innocent? Why does the prosecution say it happened? Why does the defense say it happened? Why does the defense say it happened, but it could be something slightly different than what they said, right? We can construct 1,000 different stories. Typically, we're not going to construct that many. Typically, we can construct how many? Actually, maybe 3, 4, 5. But when we start constructing too many, we lose track of them. Okay? And what this does then, it gives us one or more interpretation of the evidence or stories, various stories. And then we're going to sit there and we're going to judge these stories to determine which is the best story. And this judgment is going to rely on 3 certainty principles. Coverage, coherence, and uniqueness. This is all still part of step 1. The 4th principle doesn't apply to constructing the story. It applies to a later process. Okay? So, we're still in the process of constructing a story. There's 3 certainty principles that we're going to rely upon here. Coverage, coherence, and uniqueness. So, coverage. Don't try to focus on what it says verbatim in the book or in the Pennington and Hasty article. Just think for a second. Outside of that. Okay? If we're talking about the quality of a story, what does coverage mean? Completeness. How well the story what? Covered what? Explain the information that you have, right? Coverage refers to the extent to which the story explains what I know occurred. Does that make sense? Okay? So in a trial, it's the extent to which the story accounts for all the evidence that I have. In a story that accounts for all the evidence I have, is that more or less believable? More. If I have a story that can't account for 5 pieces of evidence, it's not a very good story. I could still construct it, right? And say, I don't know how it can, still don't know how this stuff could have occurred, right? But it's going to be a less believable story because it doesn't account for all the evidence. That's the first principle of certainty when it comes to assessing the story, okay, is coverage. The more it covers, the more likely it is I'm going to choose that as my best story. All right? The second thing is coherence. What does coherence mean? What do we mean if somebody has a coherent explanation? It's clear. It's logical. How well it follows. Easy to understand. Right? So is this about, does it cover all the evidence? It might or might not. Coverage is separate. Coherence is how well the story does what? Makes sense, is reasonable. How well it connects the dots, okay? And there's 3 things that are going to matter to coherence. Here it's how much does the story cover. Here it's the quality of the story. Right? And there's going to be 3 things that matter in quality of a story. First is consistency. What does that mean? Yeah, right? A consistent story is one that is the same, right? It's one that isn't changing, right? A consistent story is one that has no contradictions. Right? Let's go back to the Bill Clinton one, right? His consistent story was, I never had sexual relations with that woman, okay? Guys might not remember this because this was back in the 90s as well, okay? Right? People are sitting there saying, some people, the people that believe his story, sit there and say, well, he didn't contradict himself. Because he didn't have sexual relations with her. Right? But other people that don't believe him say, well, no, you contradicted yourself. Does that make sense? Right? That's a contradiction there. Next thing that matters to how coherent the study is the story, is plausibility. What does it mean to be plausible? Not is it possible, is it likely? Right? Plausibility is not possibility. Right? Things can be possible, but just not likely. Plausibility is how likely is it? Is it similar to what the jurors expect to happen in other situations? Oh shit, what does this sound like? Representativeness. You see in that now all of a sudden, like those basic concepts of availability and representativeness are coming into play in these larger models? Right? Availability can influence the story I construct. More easy examples that bring to mind are more likely to be brought into this story. Representativeness will affect how plausible I think this is. How similar is this to other things I've encountered or my expectations about the world? And then lastly, what's completeness? Maybe, maybe not. Completeness. It has all the key parts. Coverage is only related to how well does it cover the evidence I've been given. But the evidence I've been given might be incomplete. Right? So completeness is about other things. And a good example of this is the Casey Anthony case, which in the future I might, see there's just so much to follow on that. It might not be a good one to use. But in the Casey Anthony case, the prosecution was convinced that she murdered little Kaylee and that she did it with malice aforethought. She intended the murder, it was premeditated. So they were pushing for murder 1. So they constructed this story and presented their evidence such that it met the criteria for murder in the first degree. And their story covered all the evidence that they presented. But they didn't do a good job of making it a complete story. Like explaining why a mother who, for all intents and purposes, viewed by others, said that she was a doting, affectionate, caring mother. All the witnesses, character witnesses, came in and said Casey Anthony, they never saw any evidence of any abuse on this child. That, if anything, Casey bent over backwards for this child and did everything for this child. So, we're sitting here and we're saying, although they presented their evidence and they covered their evidence with their story, the prosecution, it was incomplete, and that there's missing key evidence of why the hell would this woman who everybody says loved her daughter immensely do this. It was missing a key piece of information. They didn't provide it. They were hoping that the juror would just make that connection, but they couldn't. They didn't provide it, and so therefore it was incomplete, even though it covered the evidence that they had. Does that make sense? So coverage is different, or excuse me, completeness is different than coverage. Huh? Well, they tried to give a lack of they gave a motive that she just wanted her life back and all that stuff, okay? But it was incomplete in that there's a key piece of evidence there that they're not covering, which is the explanation as to why somebody who is all intents and purposes a loving mother would do something. They didn't draw that causal connection there. Right? They found her body months afterwards. They found her body in November and she disappeared in June. Last thing is uniqueness. What does uniqueness suggest? And by uniqueness, we're referring to the uniqueness of what? The story. Okay? I have multiple stories. I'm going to select a story that is what? That stands out from the others. Is more unique. And by more unique, we mean a story that is the most coherent and the highest in coverage. And a story that is obviously more coherent and has more coverage is going to stand out amongst the other stories that I have. So I'm going to be likely to do what? Believe it. I'm going to select that story as the story that's going to serve the basis of my decision. But if I have a bunch of different stories that are all equal in coherence and coverage, what's the problem? Yeah, it's just I can't select one story as being the best story because all of them are equal in how much they cover and how coherent they are. Right? Prosecution story makes sense to me. The defense's story makes sense to me. I can't pick between the two. Right? And so if I can't pick between the two, I can't identify that single story that best represents this scenario. I haven't been able to explain this well. Okay? So, that's the first step. We're going to come back and review this next class, but I want to at least present this to you here right now before we go, which is what is step 2 on this, which is representing the decision alternatives. Okay? So the first step is constructing and selecting the best story. The second step here then is representing what my alternatives are. So, the jurors get this information from 2 areas. And what do I mean by this? What is the alternatives that jurors have? Nope. Guilty, not guilty on a variety of charges. Okay? Those are the alternatives that they have. And so, that information can come from judicial instructions. Basically what happens is after the trial is over, okay, after the defense and the prosecution has rested their case, they've done their closing arguments, the judge then sets out and reads the jury a bunch of instructions. These instructions are about the legal process of what they're allowed to do when they make a decision, when they render the verdict. Included in those instructions are descriptions of what the charges are and what would be required to have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt to convict somebody on that charge. Okay, I'm going to show you an example here in a minute of that. Okay? So the judicial instructions are going to play a role, but also jurors come in with their expectations about, if you're on trial, or if you're on a jury and it's a murder trial, you have your own expectation. What does it mean to be murder in the first degree? Planned. That's your interpretation of what it means. Right? So of course you're going to have what the judge tells you, but you're also going to have your own preconceptions about it as well. Right? So that's going to influence that. So let's take a look here at an example from, let's talk about these here, okay? So all these alternatives are represented by specific things. Identity, mental state, circumstances, and actions. What is identity? Who did it? All right? So every verdict option is going to have a situation of you need to identify who did it. You need to identify what? Mental state. What's that mean? Not their competency, because they've already been deemed competent to stand trial. Their state of mind at the time of the crime. Okay? What are the circumstances? The situation in which the crime occurred. What environmental factors were present at the time of the crime. All right? And then lastly, what are actions? What they did. Right? So every verdict option is going to clearly identify, you have to determine who did what was their mental state at the time of the crime, what other factors were present, and what did that individual do. Does that make sense? Right? An example of circumstances would be, did I shoot this person in self-defense? Yeah, it happens. It happened in Olympia. It happens fairly often, a lot more often than we think it does. I mean, a lot of homicides are not deemed to be murder. Huh? Well, no, because it's viewed to be justifiable. Or an accident. Could be an accident or justifiable, right? But that's what we mean. So that would be the environmental factors. They did shoot the person. We know who did it. We know they shot him, but the environmental factors makes that it's not murder. It was self-defense. Right? But these are all the things that we have to consider here. So let me just show you what Washington standards are to get an idea of how this could be represented. All right? So here are different standards in Washington for murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, or manslaughter in the first degree. I've highlighted something in here. What is the key thing that I've highlighted here across each of these? So let's go back to the last list of things. The mental state. Right? We see how the different verdict definitions take this into account. Identity is, that person did this. Mental state, difference amongst these. In each of these, is the action and the identity the same thing? This individual caused the death of another person. So action and identity is exactly the same in all of these verdict options, right? What differs here is the mental state. Did they have premeditated intent? Did they intend to without premeditation? Or did they just recklessly cause? No intent, no premeditation. Do you see that? So this is what a juror could be presented with. And they construct then their understanding of these different verdict options of, okay, this is actor. I know who the identity is. I know the action caused the death of somebody, but these different verdict options are now, okay, did they intend to do this and they premeditated it? Did they intend to do it without premeditation? Or did they just recklessly do it? Does that make sense? And then I'm going to understand and represent all these verdict options. The next class we'll come back and we'll talk about how do I then take my understanding of the verdict options and the story I've identified to be the best story and use them together to render the verdict that I want to render, to determine what the appropriate verdict is. Okay? All right, let's get out of here. 10:05 exactly.